Thanks again, everyone around the world, for fitting me in your busy schedule. Laszlo Montgomery here with another installment of this China History podcast series that is offering you a no-nonsense overview of the history of Yunnan province. Part 4 for you here. We're going to focus on the Panthay Rebellion this time, 1856 to 1873, a time we're quite familiar with, filled with uprisings, unrest, and revolts in all four corners of the Qing Empire. The Taiping Rebellion ran concurrent with the Panthay Rebellion for almost 8 years. The Nian Rebellion, almost 12. And down in southern Guangdong, the Panthay Cantonese fought their bloody battles with the Hakka people for almost the entirety of the Panthay Rebellion years. So keep this in mind while our story unfolds. In addition to the more powerful countries pushing China around in their own land, the Manchu Qing imperial government had its hands full trying to hold their empire together. That word, Panthay, was the anglicized term for the Burmese word used for the Yunnanese Muslims. And the same word was also used for Burmese Muslims who trace their origin from Yunnan. Contradicting etymological interpretations exist about how the word Panthay came about, but that's the main idea. That's what Western historians called this 17-year conflict. The Chinese named it after the leader of the rebellion, Du Wenxiu. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, these Yunnanese were called the Haw, H-A-W, no matter they were Hui or not. It was one big transnational subculture made up of Muslims who lived amongst their Buddhist brothers and sisters in Yunnan, Burma, Vietnam, Laos, and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. Because of the regional caravan trading that the Muslims so dominated, the Hui moved freely back and forth, always engaging with fellow Muslims across the western border in the Shan and Kachin states of Myanmar. We left off last time with that disturbance in Baoshan, October 1845. Although it resulted in a great loss of life, this wasn't the first time the Hui were on the receiving end of Qing attacks and suffered loss of life and property. But it reached a point following this bloody incident in Baoshan where emotions got so hot, the Hui looked to their own community leaders to go to bat for them and seek redress from the government. Every historic rebellion in China had its charismatic leaders, Hong Xiuquan and the Taipings. There was Huang Chao, Zhang Jue and the Yellow Turbans, Chen Sheng and Wu Guang of the Dazixiang Uprising, Fang La. There's so many that we remember. The Panthay Rebellion had as its leader, as I just said, Du Wenxiu. Among the numbers of Muslims who had been killed in Baoshan, the old city of Yongzheng, were family members of Du Wenxiu. His family wasn't considered ethnic Hui. They were Han Chinese who had converted to Islam. And Du was born in 1823 in Baoshan. He was educated in the classics and received his Xiucai degree by age 16. So this is during the time of Emperor Daoguang, prior to the Treaty of Nanjing. And Du Wenxiu comprised a small group of applicants who, failing to receive an adequate response from Yunnan local officials about this attack on their Hui community, took their case all the way to the imperial court in Beijing to seek compensation for the loss of life and property. All the procedures required to bring one's complaint before the imperial court were followed, and after they had their chance to meet, the emperor decided to rehabilitate none other than the great Chinese hero of the Opium War, Lin Zexu, and send him to go serve as the new viceroy of Yunnan and Guizhou. There was a lot of investigating and rounding up the usual suspects, but despite the best efforts of such sacred cows as Lin Zexu, the Hui complainants weren't given any justice in the matter, and the hard feelings remained. There was a noted Hui leader at that time named Ma Dexin, who was a respected imam who was looked up to not only in his community, but around other parts of Yunnan for his Islamic scholarship, his world travels, and for having performed the Hajj. Like most Huis, he traced his ancestry back to Sayyid Ajall Shams al-Din Omar during the Yuan. He'll be actively involved in the Panthay Rebellion, Ma Dexin was on the side of the Panthays in the beginning, but he tried to keep a foot in both camps, acting in a mediating role. He had a large role in the Panthay Rebellion, and there's a lot of mystery surrounding his actions, or alleged actions, and his death as well. Into the 1850s, all throughout Yunnan, there were problems with sporadic Hui and Han violence. By the end of 1855, there was a larger than usual disturbance in a place called Lin'an, today a township located in Jianshui County, a little south of Kunming. By this time, the Qing army was spoiling for a fight. The volume of Han Chinese blood spilled in Lin'an in this latest incident involving the Hui was enough of a casus belli for the officials in the capital to do what they ended up doing. Now keep in mind, right as this was happening in and around Kunming, the same or similar events were going on to the west of Yunnan in Guizhou. When we get to the history of Guizhou, we'll focus on the nature of the uprisings there. I just wanted to mention this. Both Yunnan and Guizhou are next-door neighbors, both with many ethnic minority people living there, and both were rife with rebellion during the 19th century. Du Wenxiu fought in this Lin'an conflict and had been captured by the Qing. He was able to make a break for it in the following year, 1856, the year of the dragon. There was another particularly violent episode in Chuxiong over mining rights, what else, that resulted in more one-sided measures taken by Qing officials against Hui protesters trying to defend their rights. The government was clearly aiding and abetting the strong-arm tactics being carried out by local Han business interests against Yunnan's Hui residents. And one could say later on, the government became accessories after the fact. And then on May 19th, 1856, a high-ranking official in Kunming posted a public announcement that minced no words in its call for people to rise up and murder all Muslims in Kunming. And the word was spread that there would be no repercussions for any of the killers. Nobody was going to be held liable for whatever atrocities they committed in their actions against Kunming's Muslim community. And in a short span of time, only a few days, the Muslims of Kunming, whole families included, were all murdered in cold blood. Casualty estimates are all over the place, between 3,000 to 7,000 people. There were 5 mosques located in Kunming. All were looted and torched. This Kunming massacre, as it became known, it wasn't a pogrom in the strict sense of the word, but it targeted a specific ethnic group, the Hui Chinese, for persecution. Everything had been heading in this direction since the 1830s and 40s. Not that this Kunming massacre was necessary for the ethnic Hui to know where their community stood in the new majority Han Chinese Yunnan, but it was a serious enough incident that led many Hui to take up arms against their tormentors. Things ramped up very quickly after this Kunming massacre. Du Wenxiu was a very hands-on rebel leader and led his soldiers into battle himself. His first big moment came in the wake of the Kunming massacre. A few months after it happened, Du raised an army in Menghua and led a summer revolt against the Qing army. From Menghua, today's modern-day Weishan County, he marched straight north into Dali. And he declared furthermore that his group was taking its marching orders from the Taiping rebel leadership, who were also on their murderous rampage at this time. Just what the Yongzheng Emperor needed. Like the Taiping rebels, later around 1861, 1862, orders will go out from Du Wenxiu to all men to cut their Manchu-style queues and to xu fa, to grow their hair long in the style of the Chinese warriors of yore, and most recently the Taiping rebels. That was always a great symbol of defiance to Manchu rule. And following Du Wenxiu's surprise victory in Menghua over experienced Qing troops, more Hui militia groups were formed, and what started off as sporadic cases of early 19th century petty ethnic violence between newly arrived Han migrants and the local Hui deteriorated into greater acts of bloodshed. And by the 1840s, so out of hand had the disputes become, it had finally all led to this. On October 23, 1856, after taking the city of Dali, Du Wenxiu established the Pingnan Kingdom, the pacified southern state or sultanate. Du declared himself the Bingma Dayuan Shuai, or Generalissimo. Hong Xiuquan had his Taiping Tianguo Heavenly Kingdom. This Pingnan Kingdom, or Sultanate if you prefer, was the entity associated with the Panthay Rebellion. The Qing authorities were shocked at the speed at which this uprising that began in Menghua spread to other parts of Yunnan. After beginning his quest to raise an army in Menghua, Du Wenxiu's cause didn't have to do too much advertising to bring rebels to their side. These mainly consisted of their fellow Hui, but they were also joined in this struggle by their natural allies, the Yi people and other ethnic tribespeople, who were old hands at scrapping with the Chinese. They all shared common cause, and with the Yi joining the fight, there was all this talk amongst their people being bandied about regarding the glory days of the Nanzhao Kingdom. Du Wenxiu's Pingnan Sultanate had its own laws, government structure, used Islamic terms and titles. Ma Dexin co-led the government with Du. Du Wenxiu was also called Sultan Suleiman. At its peak, Pingnan controlled half of Yunnan province. Pingnan wasn't an Islamic state. There was plenty of evidence of Han imperial slogans, symbols, images, and in the laws, one would be able to see a kind of blend of Han, Islamic, and indigenous traditions. The Arabic language was utilized as a kind of Guanhua, or official language, used in state and diplomatic situations. It was quite an inclusive government from our modern perspective. Most of the bureaucrats within Pingnan were Han Chinese. By no means were they excluded. In Yunnan, there were plenty of villainous characters from this time in the mid-19th century. One of them who fit the bill to a T was the Manchu governor, Shu Xing-a. He's credited with taking this outrage to the next level when he gave the order to Chi Ge Fu Ting Zhou Xian Ju Tuan Sha Hui, or calling for the killing of all Hui throughout all of Yunnan province. And from this point, the whole thing turned into a Qing government-sponsored decimation of Yunnan's Hui minority. It all happened so fast. 1856, after a couple of incidents where the Qing government laid their cards on the table as far as who they sided with and what they stood for, the Hui knew they had to fend for themselves. Who were they going to call? The local government? They were the ones directing all these attacks on their communities. So this was a pretty dark chapter in Qing history. And 1856 is the year most history books mark the beginning of the Panthay Rebellion. There were a whole number of reasons the Hui Chinese were targeted for persecution, starting with their customs and points of differentiation from traditional Han Chinese culture. It's been suggested by some historians that many simply wanted to tear them down in order to feast on their considerable assets, especially in mining and commerce, sort of like what happened to the Osage Nation in 1920s Oklahoma. So this led directly to the Panthay Rebellion, but Yunnan's Hui Chinese weren't taking this lying down. The massacre carried out in Kunming just didn't come out of nowhere. The hard feelings had been percolating for more than half a century. And when we look at current events going on today in Yunnan, minor though they may arguably be, with the Hui people, we can view this problem with a nice, long lens and see it as a continuation of a history that ebbed and flowed long before the recent changes in the laws. So this disturbance down in the southwest of China took a long time to quell due to all these other domestic conflicts that were grabbing the attention and resources of the Manchu Qing government. Emperors Daoguang, Xianfeng, Tongzhi. Almost makes you wince in pain to hear those three royal names. Not that Guangxu had it easy, but the disgrace and diplomatic indignity suffered by those three emperors in particular set the tone for all that was to follow till the final death of the dynasty, and even into the early Republican period. So as this story of the Panthay Rebellion starts to unfold, keep this historical backdrop in mind. The internal strife, these decades of the 1850s, 60s, 70s, this was the period when herds of global hustlers and corporations were clamoring to get in on any kind of China business. Weapons manufacturers were feasting in China during these embryonic years that served as the yellow brick road to 1916 and the beginning of the warlord era. The nemesis of Du Wenxiu and the Panthay rebels was an ethnic Zhuang from Guangxi named Can Yuying. He got his start organizing a private militia that fought on the Qing side against the Taiping rebels. Circumstances led him to Yunnan, where he found employment defending mining interests from bandits, and then the Panthay Rebellion broke out, and he volunteered his services to the provincial officials. So in 1857, the rebels who gathered around Du Wenxiu were at their most robust, and the Qing army was performing poorly during this early outset, and matters were not going well for the dynasty up in Guizhou either. And Can Yuying hadn't been able to make a difference in the war effort leading government troops against the Hui. This insurrection was proving to be no flash in the pan, and it was still flaming hot in 1858. Diplomacy was being carried out throughout the conflict. Besides the efforts of Ma Dexin, other Muslim mediators were called in from other provinces to make earnest attempts at reconciling both sides. But no one was given an inch. The whole province was now in revolt. Whatever was agreed to in the morning was already broken by the evening. The Hui and Qing sides were both not dealing in good faith and trying to finish off the other. They had no idea how early in the conflict it still was. Can Yuying, at this time, after a less than optimal showing so far in Yunnan, went back to Guangxi to regroup and recruit his own army rather than try his luck again with Qing soldiers. Another major figure who comes to the fore around this time, in 1858, is another ethnic Hui called Ma Rulong. What's interesting about him was that he never formally joined Du Wenxiu's movement and just shared common cause with him. He had his own reasons to fight against the Manchus. His brother had been unjustly killed by the Qing authorities, and that was what pushed him in the direction he found himself. Ma Rulong represented a third entity in the Panthay Rebellion who leaned towards the Pingnan kingdom side, but led his own faction. And right in the capital of Kunming, Ma Rulong raised an army of faithful in 1858. He supported Du Wenxiu, but he and his followers remained apart from the Pingnan kingdom and Dali. Wherever he could block Qing attacks against the Panthay rebels, he did so. In the beginning, he was a useful asset to Du Wenxiu, but these two had some conflicts regarding ideology and the identity of the Hui people, and they wrestled for hearts and minds among the Hui of Yunnan throughout the 1860s. Ma Rulong's power base was in the south and central part of Yunnan. As the violence and disruption to society at large got worse, Ma Dexin tried to use his auspices as a community leader with all the added gravitas he carried in his person and tried to bring both sides together. But both sides didn't trust him, and he ended up defecting to the Qing side in 1861. In the meantime, the Panthay rebels were still gaining in momentum. Despite everything being thrown at them, they used the widespread latent discontent of the Hui and Yi populace as well as their home field advantage to keep the Qing army on the defensive. And they continued to win major battles throughout 1861, and nothing looked like it was slowing down. August 1861, the Xianfeng Emperor died, leaving the 5-year-old Tongzhi Emperor in charge, meaning from here on out, the Empress Dowager Cixi will be calling all the shots up in the Forbidden City. And with the departure of Ma Dexin as co-ruler of the Pingnan state, Du Wenxiu's supporters began pushing him to finally declare himself the Pingnan Wang, or King of Pingnan, rather than the Bingma Dayuan Shui title that he had carried since 1856. And now, at his most powerful, Du Wenxiu started to take on more honorific titles. Can Yuying had rejoined the fight in 1859, and since this return to Yunnan, Can had met with some success against the Hui forces. His success in the face of greater Qing losses caught the attention of the authorities, and when it was learned in 1864 that the Hui rebel leader Ma Rulong was considering switching sides, Can went to Kunming to negotiate this with him. This was a pretty devastating body blow to the Panthay rebel leadership when Ma Rulong surrendered to the Qing and began fighting on their side. Both Ma Dexin and Ma Rulong had been amply rewarded for their defection to the Qing side, and interestingly, from this point on, Ma Rulong and Du Wenxiu carried out years of a vigorous Jefferson and Adams-like correspondence, debating each other on all their areas of disagreement. In 1863, you could say the momentum in the Panthay Rebellion had been lost. Can Yuying, after getting off to a slow start, now had both Ma Rulong's Hui army and additional fighting men from defecting Hui generals who had come over to his side. They took the fight straight to Du Wenxiu's forces with the objective of taking back the Panthay stronghold of western Yunnan. Well, June 1st, 1864, Hong Xiuquan died. And as you recall from, I don't know how many past CHP episodes, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom didn't outlive him for that long. And by August of that year, it was all over. Followed, of course, by the terrible bloodletting that followed the retaking of Nanjing by Li Hongzhang's forces. Keep that in mind when we reach the crescendo of the Panthay Rebellion. Although he had been sidetracked fighting against Miao rebels out in Guizhou, for all his contributions made so far, Can Yuying was made the lieutenant governor of Yunnan. Ma Dexin, risking his own well-being, personally went to Dali on behalf of the Qing to appeal to Du Wenxiu to give it up. And this went nowhere, and Du Wenxiu's troops had been repeatedly victorious into 1864 against Can Yuying on the battlefield. But now, with the Taiping Rebellion out of the way, more resources were now available in the southwest to deal with all the unrest in Yunnan and Guizhou. The Taiping Rebellion was over, but the Nian Rebellion still had a few years to go yet. By the time that conflict, that cost 100,000 or more lives, burned itself out in 1868, there was little else to distract the Qing military. By 1866, there were still 23 cities in western Yunnan under the control of Du Wenxiu's Pingnan Sultanate, with more government and private armies dedicated to quashing this rebellion. Du Wenxiu's campaign to grab the capital of Kunming met with very stiff resistance. In 1867, Du Wenxiu sent a 200,000-strong Muslim army east to go take Kunming. And as this massive Panthay rebel army marched east on Kunming, the Yunnan governor, Hang Chun, committed suicide in the face of his failure to halt this uprising. Can Yuying was named as his replacement and served as acting governor. And when these Hui troops arrived in Kunming, they surrounded the city, which, like most cities in China, was protected by a wall, and they began their siege. This was a very successful siege, and the Hui antagonizers were able to put the Kunming inhabitants in very desperate straits. But now in 1868, times had changed, and the Qing military was able to focus on this Panthay Rebellion more closely. Can Yuying was made the governor of the province in March of that year and was back to the hilt militarily. Unlike Du Wenxiu's troops, Can Yuying had access to all these latest weapons being sold by the mid-19th century European merchants of death operating in China. So he brought something new to this conflict, and all these weapons made a difference. And besides all this, Can Yuying was a veteran of the Taiping Rebellion, had fought against the Miao in Guizhou, as well as the French in the Sino-French War. Into the summer of 1868, Can Yuying, at the head of an army of 30,000 Qing troops, fought pitched battles all around the outskirts of Kunming, but no one was decisively coming away victorious. but the tide changed in favor of the Qing army, and by November 1868, the city was liberated from the siege. The combined armies of Ma Rulong and Can Yuying were able to not only break the siege and put Du Wenxiu on the defensive, but by the end of that year, 1868, they began pushing the Hui rebels out of all the cities in eastern Yunnan that the Panthay rebels had taken over the past decade. And then Can Yuying started to take the fight directly to the Pingnan stronghold of western Yunnan. And one by one, all the cities under Panthay rebel control were taken back, and it was only a matter of time before the Qing army turned their sights on the Pingnan capital of Dali. So as 1871 approached, Du Wenxiu looked out at his sultanate and knew the end was nigh, unless he was able to get some outside support, and this led to a strange little sidebar to the history of this Panthay Rebellion that's not terribly well known, but certainly quite amusing. It all began in 1868 with a trade agreement that had been reached between the British and Burma and Du Wenxiu, or Sultan Suleiman as they called him. The British and Burma were trying to build up a southwestern trade route into China to counter what the French had going on in Vietnam and Laos. The British saw Yunnan as strategically important for all their big ideas for the region. Since Yunnan was under the control of the Panthays, the British negotiators went around the Qing and cut a deal directly with Du Wenxiu. And these adventurous and dashing British men of their day who operated in this part of the world cultivated this relationship they had with Du, and this led to some cooperation into the 1870s. That's why in 1871, as Du Wenxiu got more and more desperate, he ordered his son and heir, known as Prince Hassan, to carry out a secret mission to enlist the support of Great Britain in their fight against the Qing in Yunnan. Du was proposing to make Queen Victoria the sovereign of the Pingnan Sultanate and to become a vassal of Britain. Prince Hassan was loaded up with letters, documents, and 4 boxes of gifts for Queen Victoria and other high-ranking officials, and what became known as the Panthay Mission of 1872 was off and running. The young prince traveled with a small entourage and was accompanied by one British man named Thomas Thornville Cooper for the entirety of the mission. He was another soldier of fortune who saw action in the Taiping Rebellion and now found himself in this part of the world, Yunnan, Burma. He served as the minder and fixer for Prince Hassan's small delegation of 3+ servants. But let's just say Mr. Cooper was prone to taking quite a number of liberties with respect to expenses associated with the mission that were charged to the government. That's a funny little side story that I won't get into here, interesting though it is. In March 1872, the group arrived in Yangon. What followed was sort of a farce. The British authorities in Yangon probably misconstrued the importance of this mission, or perhaps got too vested in the potential future trade benefits of cozying up to Du Wenxiu. The Chief Commissioner of British Burma, Sir Ashley Eden, he didn't know what to do with them and Prince Hassan's requests for British backing. And this official in British Burma was hardly the person to speak on behalf of the Foreign Office and the British government. And rather than send them back to where they had came from, Eden, perhaps just to humor them or rid himself of this annoyance, encouraged them to try their luck in London. And he set this whole thing in motion. And when the India office found out about this, they were not thrilled. So by the end of May 1872, 3 Chinese and their British minder arrived at the Charing Cross Hotel, today the Claremont Charing Cross, situated on the Strand at Charing Cross Station. Unbeknownst to them, as they unpacked their bags and their nice digs in this nice part of London, the Qing army was attacking Dali and kind of coming in for the kill. Well, to make a long story short, by the time all the authorities in Parliament and Buckingham Palace got wise as to what was going on with this delegation trying to meet with them, they were aghast that something this preposterous had managed to get this far and had risen this high up. Because the India office hadn't been aware of the mission or did nothing to stop this in its tracks after the okay was given in Burma to proceed to London, they had to suffer the wrath of the Gladstone government. The British authorities who got sucked into this unpleasantness spent weeks trying to figure out a way to nicely get rid of Prince Hassan and his delegation. On June 28th, they decided to finally deal with it. Expenses at the Charing Cross Hotel were piling up, 70 quid a week, and Thomas Cooper, the fixer, who accompanied Prince Hassan's party, well, as I said, he was quite adept at piling up the debts being covered by Your Majesty's government. By the time word reached Beijing about what was going on back in the home country, the British minister there, Thomas Francis Wade, of Wade Giles fame, he did a full-on facepalm. At once, Wade fired off a message to London explaining these Panthays were on the cusp of getting annihilated and don't put any chips on anything Prince Hassan was proposing. Furthermore, Wade stated the obvious. If word ever got out about this, that Her Majesty's government was putting the heir to the rebel leader up at the Charing Cross Hotel and was allowing him to mix with highly placed government officials, that would not go down well in the halls of the Forbidden City. So all the best minds who got sucked into this whole affair put their heads together and came up with a plan to let Prince Hassan down gently so that there was no embarrassment or loss of face. And lots of kind and noble words were said and written down, and whatever gifts they had lying around were wrapped up with a bow and presented to the prince. And by the end of July 1872, the letters and gifts the heir to the Pingnan throne brought with him had all been formally refused by the British authorities. They unofficially took them off Prince Hassan's hands and put them in storage somewhere. And after 16 weeks in Blighty, on September 21st, 1872, after meticulous logistical planning, the three Chinese departed and started heading back home. By December, Prince Hassan's delegation arrived in Yangon, only to hear the shocking news that Dali was under siege. Under the present circumstances, it wasn't wise to return to Dali, so Prince Hassan, he became an exile in Burma. And just as Thomas Francis Wade feared, indeed, the whole affair got out, and the Qing officials extracted maximum amounts of flesh from the Brits for harboring Prince Hassan like they did. By November, after a series of victories, Can Yuying's troops began putting the squeeze on Dali. On December 10, 1872, after a 6-month siege, Qing soldiers were able to dig a tunnel under the Dali city wall in the southeast part. And after blowing up a portion of the wall, the Hui army was forced to retreat to the northwest part of the city. And by December 26, 1872, imperial troops had surrounded Dali. It was all about to end. Hoping to spare the residents from a probable wholesale slaughter by Can Yuying's troops, after first poisoning his 3 wives and 5 daughters, Du Wenxiu surrendered to the Qing in January of 1873. He was duly charged with his crimes, and legend has it that en route to Kunming, where he was being taken for certain execution, he swallowed a ball of opium. Now, version 1 of this story says he died by the time they got to Kunming, but was decapitated anyway, and his severed head was then placed inside a honey jar and sent to the emperor. Version 2 says he survived all the way to Kunming and was then executed and decapitated. The part about his head, put in the honey jar, was also mentioned in this second version of Du Wenxiu's grim ending. And for a job well done, in the autumn of 1873, Can Yuying was made Viceroy of Yungui, the macro region comprising Yunnan and Guizhou. Despite Du Wenxiu's sincerity in surrendering and pleading for the lives of the city's inhabitants, Dali's Hui were decimated. Over 10,000 men, women, and children were killed. And 3 days after Du Wenxiu's surrender, Qing troops went in and did their worst, as ordered. And people fleeing to Lake Ortai drowned in the lake. And by May 1873, the last city held by the Panthays fell to the Qing. Estimates say 10,000 killed. Some are even higher. Soldiers were ordered to cut off one ear from each Dali inhabitant they killed, and 24 baskets of severed ears were sent along to Beijing along with Du Wenxiu's head. When it was all over, at least half the population of Yunnan suffered death or deprivation from the 17 years of conflict in the Panthay Rebellion. Following all these years between 1700 to 1850 of large-scale migration of Han Chinese to Yunnan, by the 1870s, the province had been seriously depopulated. If you're wondering what happened to Ma Dexin, it's believed Can Yuying had him killed. He died mysteriously and not of natural causes or disease either. One last thing I wanted to mention from this time that's related to Yunnan. The third plague pandemic began there. The first pandemic was the plague of Justinian, 541, 542, and it lingered on for a long time after. And the second pandemic is the most famous. That's the Black Death of 1346 to 1353, brought to Europe, the Mediterranean, and North Africa via Mongol caravans. And then there was this one, the third plague pandemic. The bubonic plague had been present in Yunnan since the 1780s, and all the way into 1830 there were dozens of small outbreaks of varying virulency, but it was something very common to Yunnan province. So it will take till 1894 before French and Japanese scientists figured out how plague spread. So prior to that time, people had an idea that it had something to do with rats, but when it hit, it spread easy. And that was the case with this third plague pandemic that had its origins in Yunnan during the chaos of the Panthay Rebellion. Following the end of the Panthay Rebellion, amidst all the death and conspicuous devastation, there was a bad outbreak, and into the 1890s, bubonic plague spread to Guangxi, where it spread to Guangdong province, and in no time at all, there were similar outbreaks in Guangzhou and Hong Kong in 1894. And once it made it that far, it spread to every seaport in the world where these vessels called. Anyway, just mentioning this. About 19 million people died from this pandemic, 10 million in India, 2 million in China, and 3 million elsewhere in the world. And it hung in there for over a century, not disappearing until the 1960s. Anyway, I'd like to close things out with a retelling of an interesting footnote from this whole period. If you remember from previous episodes, there was an incident that happened not long after the end of the Panthay Rebellion called the Margary Affair of February 1875. It involved one Augustus Raymond Margary, a 28-year-old vice consul and interpreter in the employ of the Brits. One of my favorite writers, UK-based David Lethman, wrote about this incident from History in the Diplomat a few years ago. I have to get him on the CHP one day. He's my go-to guy for that period and that part of the world. I'll try not to drag this whole thing out. Because of the way world events were shaping up, let's just say the whole idea of being able to use their advantageous position in Burma to build a transport link to Yunnan and make that their launching pad into China from that direction, because of all the strategic and potential commercial benefits, well, this idea, later called the Yunnan myth, gained all kinds of renewed support. The new Disraeli government was interested in this whole notion, and the upshot to all this was that Thomas Francis Wade was able to obtain the permission of the Qing authorities to send an exploratory expedition to go survey the situation and see what the viability was of building this railway from Burma into western Yunnan. So Marjorie left East China and sailed up the Yangtze to meet up with this team in Burma who were heading up this whole effort. And by the time Marjorie got to western Yunnan, all the local authorities, everyone was wise to this whole thing. The British side hadn't a clue how every step of the way they were being monitored and manipulated by everyone from the governor Can Yuying down to the individual village headmen. No one wanted the Brits or any foreigners in this part of Yunnan, period. And that's understandable. They had a whole way of life and established way of doing things, and they didn't want any outsiders mucking about with their very unique trading networks. So despite being warned about the dangers of being a Westerner, traveling in these more wilder parts of Yunnan, Margary pressed on to hook up with the group coming from Burma. And as Margary waited for the arrival of his colleagues, on February 21st, 1875, he was ambushed near Mangyun in the present-day Lancang-Lahu Autonomous County. And there's a sad marker at the location of Margary's murder and decapitation. David Leffman had a photo of the marker in his article. And following his murder, August Margary's severed head was hung on display outside the city wall, and the rest of his body was never recovered. Thus began a real-life whodunit that all these years later, we still don't know for certain who was responsible for the death of August Raymond Margary in that very remote part of Yunnan in the southwest of Pu'er Prefecture. As I said, no one wanted those guys there. The Qing authorities' dislike of all Europeans by 1875 was pretty red hot. The local business interests, they didn't want any outsiders penetrating their world and grabbing a piece of their pie. The indigenous people, well, they didn't even want the Han and the Manchus there, let alone these alien invaders. Can Yuying, he was the primary suspect. His profile of being a well-known xenophobe and someone prone to taking the violent way out of any situation, many fingers pointed at him. Well, I don't have to say, news didn't travel so fast back then, especially from this far out west. It took about 6 weeks before word hit the streets in Shanghai, and it took a further 8 months of British, Chinese posturing and finger-pointing before it was all agreed to send an investigative team to Yunnan to see what happened. And in March 1876, the group arrived in Yunnan and met with Can Yuying, and he let them know the Chinese side had already concluded their investigation, and they rounded up all the culprits. All were hill tribesmen from the area. And Consul Margary, well, he shouldn't have been in these parts, and the whole way it played out was not surprising. When it was clear the British were determined to launch their own independent investigation, it was predictably met with complete and total cooperation from the Qing and local authorities, with quotation marks around that word, cooperation. Every step of the way, their investigation was stymied and stonewalled, and the whole thing got nowhere, and everything led to one impasse after another, no matter on the Burma side in Kachin State or on the other side of the border in Yunnan. Everyone denied involvement. So in the end, the British were leaning very hard on the Qing authorities to hold Can Yuying responsible for masterminding the demise of Mr. Margary. And the Chinese side managed to allow themselves to get backed into a corner and were forced to agree to issuing a formal apology. This was quite a reversal of fortune in one small way. After they got caught red-handed, cavorting with the son and heir of Du Wenxiu and putting him up at such a swanky hotel, the British had been trying to sweet-talk their way out of the Prince Hassan affair of 1872, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, along came the Margary Affair in 1875. Well, you know how it is. The best defense is often a good offense. That sure turned the tables. Now Li Hongzhang was scrambling. Not only Thomas Wade, but the great Robert Hart as well. They were both intimately involved in the backroom negotiations with the Qing side to bring about some sort of a happy ending to this whole sordid affair. And many of you are already familiar with the Zhifu Convention of August 21st, 1876. This was also known as the È'ěrtài Treaty, signed by Thomas Wade and Li Hongzhang. And if you're wondering if this was one of those unequal treaties, yeah, it was. It was called that because Li Hongzhang was residing at Zhifu at that time. Again, this is today's city of È'ěrtài, and they signed it on September 13th, 1876. In three main parts, the treaty put an end to the Margary Affair, or the Dian'an, as it was also called in Chinese, the Yunnan Affair, or incident. 200,000 taels of silver was paid to Margary's family. A code of etiquette was agreed to between the British and the Qing about how to handle future diplomatic spats. 4 new treaty ports were open to trade, and limitations were put on the Laikin tax, or the Li Jin internal tariff paid by the foreign traders at all the many ports and customs offices. Can Yuying ended up having to take the fall, but with his mother's passing in 1876, it gave Li Hongzhang the convenience of assuring the British counterparts that Can had been summarily dismissed from the governorship, when actually he was only observing the Confucian tradition concerning mourning a parent. So Can Yuying went back to Guangxi, to Guilin, to mourn his late mother for 3 years. Can would later be further honored into his career. His name pops up again during the Chinese militia group known as the Black Flags, who operated in Vietnam. Can supported them in their operations against the French in Indochina. This gentleman, who is recalled in the history books as a vicious xenophobe with a hot temper, he died peacefully on June 6, 1889. He never did live down the decision he made following the surrender of Du Wenxiu and the killing frenzy on the streets of Dali that followed. The Zhifu Convention was a pretty heavy-handed, one-sided kind of treaty, and the other foreign powers, with all their vested interests in China, trying to get the best for their side, put up a lot of opposition to the treaty, and it took until 1885 to get it passed in Parliament. And one last final note about the Margary Affair. Remember how I said the emperor had to send a representative to London to offer a formal apology for everything? Well, this person selected to perform this mission was the noted Qing reformer Guo Songtao. And this mission, led by Guo Songtao to Great Britain, became the first resident Chinese legation overseas. If you've listened to all these CHP episodes going back to ancient times, this whole idea of Chinese diplomats paying tribute to other nations or even maintaining an ambassador, this never happened. When stuff went down, an envoy would be sent from the imperial court to deal with the matter. But now, with this post-Margary Affair, post-Panthay Rebellion mission to present the emperor's letter of apology to the queen on February 8, 1877, this led to the establishment of the first ever permanent, meaning like an embassy, Chinese legation office. It was located at 49 Portland Place, and if you look for that address on your Maps app, you'll see it's today the current site of the PRC Embassy. That was also the place where Sun Yat-sen got taken back to after his kidnapping, the incident that turned him into an overnight global sensation. A lot of famous and historic people went in and out of those doors since Guo Songtao's time. Anyway, this was China's first permanent overseas legation, and it was quickly followed up with similar offices in St. Petersburg, Berlin, Paris, Washington, Tokyo, and elsewhere. And with that little bit of history to add to your repertoire, let's gather up our things and bring the curtain down until next time. Once again, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from sunny, hot, and bone-dry Southern California. Think about coming back for more Yunnan history in Part 5. Until then, stay well, everyone, drink plenty of water, and I can't wait to see you all again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.